Alright, this is a position that I composed. It's white to move and win, and if you want to try to solve it before I say anything else, then you can pause the video. So if we were to interchange the king's positions, then white would have no problem winning, but the problem here is that black has a really strong king's position. Black has a simple path towards capturing white's two remaining pawns, and white still has to worry about black's passed a pawn. So black's king's not being restricted from that many squares, and white's king is too inactive to influence anything over here, and a knight doesn't control enough squares to really stop black from getting in here. So the most that the knight would be able to do is either directly defend a pawn or go after one of black's pawns and try to create a pass pawn. And we can already see that it's going to be a draw if white goes after the f5 pawn. Black's going to be winning the f4 pawn by force, and black is going to have a quick path to capturing h2. So white's best try here would be knight to h4, controlling these squares, and then it's just going to lead to a repetition after black attacks the knight and gains access to the f3 square. So now this would just lead to a repetition, and also this will lead to a repetition. So going after f5 is not going to work. White can try going after h3 via g5. So one potential path would be from f7, and another potential path would be from e6. And white can also try defending one of the pawns, but it's not going to be realistic to defend h2 since that can only be done from g4 or f3, and black's pieces can control those squares easily. So the only way white would be able to directly defend a pawn should be from e6 or from g6. The e6 square can be controlled by black's king. So let's look at knight to g6 first. The knight's going to be too overworked to worry about this pawn, so white's king's going to have to capture it. And then white's king is too late in influencing the play on the king side. White has to be careful here. Now white has one last chance to draw with knight to h4 check. And now if king to g1, then knight to g3 draws, but white needs the f-pawn, because this would be a win for black without white's f-pawn. And if king to g2, this would be a draw even without the f-pawn. If you ignore white's f-pawn, then white still gets a draw by planning to fork the king and h-pawn. It's a well-known drawing strategy against rook's pawns. So white's king's not going to be able to do anything. Now knight to d8 is a little bit different because it also helps attack h3. And black's king can't control this forever because white's king is going to get a strong position. Now knight to e6. And now instead of knight to h4 check, white has knight to g5, planning to take the h3 pawn. White doesn't have to take it yet, so white gains a move with the king, and then takes a pawn and defends own pawn. Now white's king is close enough to draw by defending a king and pawn versus king endgame, But if white tries to win, then white's king will be too far behind black's f-pawn, and black wins with this well-known reciprocal zugzwang theme, where instead of attacking the pawn from the side, allowing white to get the better end of the reciprocal zugzwang, black reserves that square and attacks from behind. White only has one square to defend, and then black puts white into zugzwang. So white's king won't be fast enough in the variations where white tries defending the f-pawn. If king takes a6, then black's king either wins both pawns by force, or we transpose to the variations we just saw. So it seems like the only thing left to look at is if the knight goes after h3 immediately, ignoring the f-pawns, and if this doesn't work, it seems like this position is going to be a draw. And now white gets a passed h-pawn. And now black's easiest way to draw is king to f3 against knight to g5. Black can play king to g4, attacking the knight and also planning king to h3, winning the pawn. And if knight to g1, then black has king to g2. And now this leads to a tied pawn race, where black's up a pawn in the resulting queen endgame, so white's forced to force a draw. And then knight to f2 also leads to a tied pawn race. Alright, so now we've seen that against black's best moves, it's going to be white who fights for the draw if white goes after the h3 pawn. So, in this variation where white goes after the h3 pawn, white's best chance would be if instead of playing the easily drawing move king to f3, black screws up with king to e4 or king to g4 attacking the knight. White wins this position because the knight is blocking the f-pawn from becoming dangerous, so the only way for black to dislodge white's position here would be to go after the knight, so it would have been better to play king to f3 immediately. If black just kind of idles up here, then white's going to be able to make progress with the king, and against king to f4, white can advance the pawn while maintaining this complementary barrier that prevents black from winning the pawn. And now white can save the pawn by coming to f4. A common winning strategy in knight and pawn endgames is to defend a pawn with a knight from behind the pawn, so that if the enemy king captures the knight, then the pawn is going to have a clear path to promotion. So white has an easy win here. The best move here would be king to f3. And now black's down a tempo compared to the variation where black played king to f3 immediately. So now there's a big difference. White's queening and black is not queening. So white wins with these methodical thematic maneuvers of the queen, where the queen prevents the pawn's promotion on every move, and then eventually we get a situation where the king is forced to either abandon the pawn or obstruct the pawn and give the attacker's king time to invade. And now this is an elementary endgame, so a lot of people are already aware that this type of situation is usually a win against a center pawn or a knight's pawn, but a draw against a rook's pawn or bishop's pawn, because against a rook's pawn, moving the king into the corner creates a stalemate, and against a bishop's pawn, moving the king into the corner is a stalemate if the queen captures the pawn. But in this special situation where the defender still has a pawn left, it's not going to be stalemate. So this is a win even with a bishop's pawn or a rook's pawn. This position is still a win. So black loses in this variation, but we saw earlier that king to f3 is an easy draw, answering knight to f2 with king takes f2 immediately. King to e5 and king to e3 also draw, but they take a little more work. The losing moves are king to g4 and king to e4, which allow knight to f2 check with tempo and give white just enough time to convert to a win. We saw that king to g4 is losing, and king to e4 is pretty much going to be the same thing, except that black also has the idea of trying to maintain a strong king's position in the center and keeping an eye on the h-pawn while avoiding conflict with the f-pawn. Now h4 is going to be a draw. The correct move here is simply king takes a6. White can afford to spend time capturing the pawn now, since white's going to have h4 if black goes after the knight. So black's best move is f4, making it harder for white to play h4 without losing the pawn. So white gets the king more active with king to b5. Then black answers with f3. If king to d4 instead, then white's king slips in with king to c6, and white doesn't have to worry about king to e3 because the knight can retreat to d1 or h1, and black's king is going to have to worsen its position to go after the knight, allowing white's king to win the f-pawn. And if black's king stays in the center, then white's king has various ways to slowly infiltrate, and the knight can plan to return to f2 when necessary to restrict the enemy king. So let's look at if black tries keeping white's king away as much as possible. Keeping this barrier, black has the opposition for now, but black's run out of pawn moves, and white's knight has infinite moves. So the knight simply makes its retreating move now, and white regains the opposition. Black's in zugzwang, so black's king is forced to let white's infiltrate. White can answer king to d4 with king to c6, or king to d6 with king to c4, and slowly invade. Black is lost. So in the king to g4 and king to e4 variations of this position, the knight to f2 check tempo is enough for white to win, and against king to e3 and king to e5 we get similar positions, but where black has enough tempo to draw. The simplest drawing move is king to f3, and black has no problems, so we've pretty much concluded that this whole variation is a draw where white goes after the h3 pawn, and we already concluded that it's a draw in the variations where white goes after the f5 pawn, and also if white defends the f4 pawn, so most players would conclude that this endgame is a draw and decide to go after the h3 pawn since that seems to offer white the best winning prospects. But it turns out that white actually has a forced win here. Rather than worrying about the pawns, white wins by only focusing on the improvement of the king's position. After king takes a6, black can go ahead and capture white's two remaining pawns, and this is a special case where black's king ends up trapped in front of his own h-pawn, allowing the possibility of a special checkmate involving insufficient material. White is able to force checkmate with just a king and a single knight, due to the obstruction created by the h-pawn and the extra moves provided by the f-pawn. Now, instead of analyzing specific moves, let's study this class of endgames from a broader perspective. So, checkmate with one minor piece is possible if the opponent has an extra piece that's blocking its king from escaping the corner, but it's more realistic with the knight because the knight can influence both light and dark squares, so it's possible for the knight to have the king in a stalemated position and then move to deliver checkmate after the pawn is forced to block its king's normal escape square. There are two different checkmating patterns with a knight against one pawn. In both of these formations, with black to move, the pawn is forced to block its king's escape square, and then the knight can deliver checkmate on the next move. But if it's white to move in one of these positions, then white's going to be in Zugzwang, and white's only way to try to win would be to transpose into the other formation, because just moving the knight's going to have the knight on the wrong color square to deliver mate. So white's going to have to move the king at some point in order to try to waste a move, and the king square has to be specific because the knight needs the other square that the king can be on. So with black to move here, white has mate in one, but with white to move, then white has to win by transposing into the other mating formation. So white gains a tempo in maneuvering the knight for the other mating pattern, and the knight covers the g3 square, and then it's the correct tempo for the other mating formation to be employed. So this mating formation should be considered the main mating formation where the king's in a stronger location. And this formation is easier to play for because the king covers the g3 square. Notice how when white plays knight to d2, planning knight to f1, it's very important that white's king is covering the g3 square here. So this should be considered the main checkmating pattern with one knight because it's easier to play for. Notice how the idea we just saw is not possible if it's white to move in this position because the g3 square becomes a problem. So with white to move in this position, it's a draw because if we try the same idea we just saw where the knight maneuvers with tempo to try to employ the other mating formation, there's a big difference here because now, after knight to f6, white only wins if black plays king to h1, and then we've transposed into the other mating formation, but black can just play king to g3 here and escape. So there's a big difference. The mating formation with white's king on f1 is harder to play for because of the g3 square. So the main mating pattern on the left is a reciprocal Zugzwang, but the formation on the right is not a reciprocal Zugzwang because white to move can transpose to the main mating pattern. So these diagrams represent the reciprocal Zugzwangs in knight versus pawn where the knight wins. So we've pretty much gone over all the circumstances in which a knight is able to force a win against one pawn. You should understand all the reciprocal Zugzwangs and understand why the pawn has to specifically be a rook pawn that's 2 moves from promotion. The same type of mating pattern doesn't work if the pawn is further back because there's not really anything forcing that the attacker can achieve unless the attacker can immediately force the pawn to the 6th rank. So the longest forced win out of all knight versus pawn positions where the knight wins is 7 moves. Knight to g4 stalemates black, forcing h3, and this transposes to what we've seen before. And the same idea doesn't work if the pawn's further back because the knight will come under attack, and if the knight is on f3 instead, then it'll be too many knight moves away from the corner. But with the second pawn on the f-file, then a knight on f3 is going to have enough time to mate, so it's possible to win even with the h-pawn further back. So white to move here mates in 16. After knight to f3, black's king is stalemated, then white's king can waste moves on f2 and f1 to exhaust the pawn moves until black's pawns reach f4 and h3. And then if white's king ends up on f2 in that position, then king to f1 mates easily, forcing h2, and then the f-pawn is going to have enough free moves before white mates. And same thing if black ever plays h2 before then. And then if white's king ends up on f1 in the position with black pawns at f4 and h3, then king to f2 doesn't work because the pawn needs the extra f2 move. But white has knight to e5, the only winning move, planning to restrict the h2 square from g4 now that the f-pawn is passed. While giving the f-pawn extra moves, white simply reinforces the stalemate, and now black's forced to give up the f-pawn and transpose to what we've already seen. So the player to move doesn't matter as often when dealing with two pawns, because there's a wider variety of winning ideas. Reciprocal zugzwang isn't as big of a theme. So it's not about memorizing every individual move, but rather recognizing the circumstances in which mate is possible, and then finding the right moves later. So this position looks like it should be a draw for sure, because white's losing the a-pawn by force, and black's king will have more freedom compared to with a pawn on a3. But if white can stalemate black's king and force the pawn to a3, then it'll be possible for white to win. And the extra doubled a-pawn is what will allow white to win by force, very similarly to the position we just saw with f and h pawns. So the key to getting a forced stalemate position is to control b2 to b4 with the king, and control b1 with the knight via d2, which can only be accomplished with one path. And the position with black's king at a2 and black to move is going to be a reciprocal zugzwang. So white only has one winning move, knight to f6. Now knight to e4, again the only winning move. White wins more easily if the knight defends a2, as we'll see after this. So black takes, then king to c2 only move. Black's going to try avoiding the a-pawn advance and avoiding stalemate for as long as possible. Then white's king covers b4 and the knight covers b1. Black avoids the corner, but the knight restricts a3 from a square that can restrict a2 on its next move. Then the king reinforces control of b1 and the knight completes the stalemate barrier. Now a3 is forced and white wins pretty much like in the position with f and h pawns. White wants to reposition the knight to b4 where it's closer to the corner in terms of knight moves, and then the extra doubled a-pawn gives white just enough time to mate. But if we were to reach this position with black to move, then after a4, white's king is blocking the c2 square, so knight to d5 would be a blunder because the knight needs to reserve the b3 square to compensate for the blocked c2 square, and d5 is too far from b3, so the knight has to reach b4 from a better square such as c6, which can't be reached immediately. But white can plan with knight to e2, knight to e4, knight to b5, which all keep the knight close to b3, so white can employ the knight to b4 check idea without worrying about an early a2. So here's a position where black's up a piece for nothing, and there's still pawns on the board, so normally in this type of endgame, black would be able to win a pawn for free and promote, but there's a problem because white has a stalemate fortress. Black can't win the pawn without stalemating white's king, and this is kind of similar to a well-known drawing position where there's no forced win here due to stalemate, and since the pawn is a stalemating piece, the knight's position doesn't matter. But here the fortress only works if the knight is on f6 specifically, where it restricts the g8 square. But this position is only a semi-fortress because black has an alternative winning method of sacrificing the pawn and then mating with one knight. If white's king avoids capturing the pawn, then black can eventually force white to take it, so black has an easy win here. So this is the idea in our original position. Black can't afford to let white keep the f-pawn, but black can try avoiding capturing the h2 pawn. So instead of king to g2 here, king to f2 holds off white's king for longer, but king to d2 forces black to either push f4 or let white's king through. Then the f4 advance allows a new breakthrough point e4, with the idea of supporting a knight on f3. So white plays king to d3, the only winning move. Now black's losing the f-pawn if f3. So king to g2 keeps f3 guarded. Now king to e2, planning to answer, king takes h2 with king to f2. So black plays king to g1, still trying to keep white's king out. But king to f3 gains ground, controlling g2. Now king takes h2 loses like how we've seen before, and king to h1 loses more quickly. So most people don't solve this composition because they're more focused on calculating possibilities instead of recognizing possibilities. Since most people don't recognize the possibility of mating with one knight, most people aren't even going to consider it in their calculations. Now let's take a look at some other endgames where mate with one minor piece is required to win. So in the next video we'll go more in depth on the two knights versus pawn endgame as well as the mathematical properties of the knight. But here black to move has an easy win with knight to d7 restricting the escape path b6 as well as b8. Now if king takes a7 then king to c7 is a blunder because the knight's the wrong tempo to mate. The correct move is king to c6 utilizing the knight's control of b8, the only reciprocal zugzwang of its kind, and black wins like how we saw before. And if king to a8 instead of capturing the knight, then now king to c7 is the correct move and the knight's the correct tempo to mate. So here black has a knight and bishop left, which is barely sufficient mating material. So after h5 most players would think the position's a draw because black's going to have to lose a piece to stop the h-pawn, either with the bishop controlling h7 or the knight controlling h6. But it turns out that black has a forced win here with bishop to e4 the only winning move. Instead of planning to take the pawn with the bishop, black simply moves the bishop in front of the pawn, inviting white to take the bishop for free. And now white would hold on the longest with king to f6, otherwise black mates more quickly with one piece than with two. So if king to h8 here, then king to f8 reserves the f7 square and black still gets the better end of the reciprocal zugzwang. Here black has the idea of using the minor pieces to set up a barrier that stops white's king and h-pawn, and then black's king can catch the a-pawn. But with white to move, h7 doesn't give black enough time, so after knight to f7 only move, and then king to g7, black's bishop is too slow to reach a better square along the long diagonal. So now it looks like it has to be a draw, but black gains time with knight to h8. And now king takes knight leads to mate with one bishop where the extra a-pawn helps black. Otherwise the bishop is simply going to head to the long diagonal to defend the knight. So if a4 then black wins with bishop to c7 or bishop to b6, but not bishop to a5 which leads to stalemate. Now taking the knight still gets mated with one bishop, and then after the bishop defends the knight, black's king can catch the a-pawn.